You know, I'm a huge fan of smartphones that take confident swings with their form factor. From the old school Motorola Atrix, which was made to be used with a separate dock, to the LG Wing, which is an excellent big screen phone that tacks on the utility of a second screen. I feel consumer tech, in general, is made better when smartphone manufacturers take bigger risks. And that's kind of why I love the Xperia Play so much. Not only is it a time capsule of when smartphones were smaller, a bit bulkier, but it was also a huge swing to define what a gaming phone should look like, even if it ultimately struck out spectacularly. For full context, we need to first look back at 2010. Sony was on the tail end of the PSP's successful run. Even if the PSP didn't sell as well as its main competitor, the Nintendo DS, it effectively demonstrated that Sony was a force that could rival Nintendo's de facto monopoly in the handheld gaming market. Whether that remained true would depend heavily on what Sony chose to release after the PSP. Unfortunately, by 2010, both Nintendo and Sony were facing down the threat of releasing new handhelds into a market being quickly dominated by mobile gaming. The mass popularity of Apple's App Store and various free-to-play games led plenty of analysts to speculate the death of the traditional video game market. For good reason, too. Large and up-and-coming developers were pouring a lot of time and resources into figuring out how they could best make use of mobile gaming platforms. Not to mention, while mobile games at the time may not have been the same quality as console games, their convenience allowed them to attract audiences who didn't traditionally play games, as well as the same casual gamers who'd led to the massive success of the DS. At the time, there was solid evidence to hypothesize that the traditional gaming market would actually shrink. And from everything that I've read, as well as having lived through that time period, Nintendo's and Sony's vastly different responses to this existential threat define their continued relationship with video game hardware. Nintendo's strategy was, of course, to essentially ignore it, run full steam ahead as they'd always done, and release two iterations on their previous consoles, the 3DS and Wii U. While there were many factors in play, it's likely this strategy of ignoring everything contributed to both consoles ultimately being Nintendo's worst-selling handheld and home consoles respectively, while also leading to the development of one of the best-selling consoles of all time. But that's a discussion for a different video. Plus, in hindsight, it's hard to blame the strategy of continuing with business as usual, considering how Sony stumbled out of the gate with their own strategy, which was, if you can't beat them, join them. But only if it's immediately successful. You see, Sony had been partnering with Swedish telecom provider Ericsson to manufacture cell phones since the early 2000s. As both a traditional video game company and a smartphone manufacturer, it should have been easy for this partnership to capitalize on a mobile gaming boom. Or at least, everyone kinda expected that of them. For years after the PSP's release, rumors swirled regarding Sony Ericsson creating a PlayStation phone, sorta like a better version of the N-Gage. Especially after advancements to the iPod and release of the iPhone started to eat into their market share, it seemed like a no-brainer to hit newer companies on their own turf. Those rumors were actually proven true in late 2010, when N-Gage leaked prototype details of what would soon be revealed as the Xperia Play. The reported specs of the smartphone seemed modern enough, but it was the slight-out physical controls and promise of PlayStation ports for Android that really sold interest in the device. By all accounts, it appeared to be exactly what folks wanted, a slightly more premium Android version of the previous year's PSP Go. The Android portion was especially important, given that Android market seriously lagged Apple's App Store at the time in terms of quality gaming experiences. A new gaming-centric smartphone paired with ported games from a known gaming brand seemed poised to revitalize the perception of Android gaming in general, while providing additional convenience to consumers. If Sony Ericsson could have pulled it off, it had been more than the casual gamers whom mobile gaming could have courted with its offerings. Even if mobile gaming consumed the entirety of the gaming market, Sony would still stand to benefit. One clear wrinkle to all of this was that Sony was still obviously invested in traditional gaming handhelds. Anything they did with their smartphones needed to not disrupt the sales of their handhelds. Even if they had the technology to bring PSP games to Android, which they reportedly demonstrated internally, or develop new first-party console-grade titles for their phones, doing so would have drawn significant focus from their core video game business. And it shouldn't be hard to see how this split focus is likely why the Xperia Play proved to be such a failure. The Xperia Play launched in April 2011 to mostly mixed reviews. Reviewers appreciated the feel of the slide-out gamepad, as well as its solid audio performance and Sony's light touch to their Android skin. What they appreciated less largely revolved around the smartphone side of things. Even for 2011, the gamepad caused the phone to feel a bit bulky overall, compared to other phones on the market. Multiple reviewers were also frustrated by the poor camera quality, lack of 4G adoption, which was just starting to hit the market by the way, and then the screen being a bit dim overall and some general awkwardness with using the device as a phone. As a Surface Duo fan, I am very aware that, especially for niche devices, reviewers sometimes miss the mark completely with their reviews due to either early units being a mess or their unique perspectives on what smartphones should be. If something like the Xperia Play launched today, it'd be very easy to see how reviewers might pan it as a technically underwhelming device, only for a community to gradually form around its form factor. Unfortunately, the Xperia Play that launched in 2011 never actually found its community, or at least one large enough to sustain its sales, for multiple reasons. The first reason is the most obvious: Sony's other handhelds. Dedicated PlayStation fans likely already had at least one PSP by the time the Xperia Play launched. And while mass adoption of the Vita, which launched in late 2011, also didn't happen, the announcement of the Vita only a few months after the Play's launch likely split attention further. From the start, the Play's headlining feature was to provide a portable, modern way to play PS1 games on an Android device. Yet, those who already invested in Sony's handhelds, their core PlayStation audience, already had access to an abundance of PS1 games through the PlayStation Store. Without the promise of unique experiences, the only real reason for PlayStation fans to pick up an Xperia Play would have been for the novelty and limited PlayStation branding, which is not a strong way to launch a new platform. Of course, that lack of new appeal could have been mitigated if there were enough Android native experiences to sell the value of physical controls. After all, even if their core audience wasn't interested, it might have been just the right product for anyone who wanted a better way to play their Android games. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the quality gaming experiences available through the Android market were fairly limited, and most didn't benefit too much from a physical controller, likely because few devices had attempted to use physical controls in the past. The Play came with a few experiences baked in, including a solid port of Crash Bandicoot. But the library wasn't big enough at launch to justify most folks buying into Sony's gaming phone ideas. More than a few Android games were eventually updated to work with the Play's controls, but the vast majority weren't necessarily the most compelling experiences, nor ones that even benefited from physical controls in general. As is the scene today, quantity over quality was the overarching principle to releasing mobile games. In fact, the only solid use case that immediately proved useful for the physical controls was emulation, as demonstrated by this video posted by N-Gage around the time the Play launched. PSP emulation might never have been the greatest on the Play, but Game Boy Advance, SNES, and Genesis emulation were pretty solid from the beginning. Shortly after launch, an exploit was even created to utilize Sony's own built-in emulator to repackage PS1 games as Android apps to use on the phone. All of which was great for a community looking for additional things to do with their phones, but less great for Sony. Given Sony's long-standing feud with emulation and piracy, emulation wasn't a selling point that they would have ever backed. I wouldn't even be surprised if the very public usage of emulation on the device contributed to them ultimately releasing so few PS1 ports to the platform. Still, even with all these gaming-related downsides to the Xperia Play, I think the even bigger issue the Xperia Play ran headfirst into was public perception. It might seem a bit odd to some folks watching this, but in general, the older audiences the Xperia Play targeted in its marketing expressed some awkwardness with its premise. Gaming, in general, has become more mainstream and culturally acceptable to talk about over the years, at least here in the US. However, back in 2011, many folks reported not wanting to be perceived negatively by others due to carrying a gaming device with them everywhere, especially into important business meetings where folks might typically bring their smartphones. As a result, the Xperia Play proved to be a particularly hard sell due to it seeming immature for folks with enough money to actually buy the device. Back in 2011, some UK retailers even reported only selling 1 or 2 devices per week, only a couple months after launch. Some even speculated that Sony should have been targeting teens instead of adults if they actually wanted to sell the phone, which, as someone who was a teen at the time, I don't necessarily disagree with. After all, given the rise of BlackBerry and iPhone as the premier business-oriented smartphone for adults by 2011, marketing to older audiences was bound to be a losing game. I can more than understand the perspective of adults seeing a device like the Xperia Play as little more than a toy. Yet, unique physical traits often made phones more appealing to younger audiences at the time, who wanted something to better express themselves individually. Heck, at the time, I was rocking an HTC Evo 4G, which I loved to death because it had a built-in kickstand. Others in my high school were customizing their keyboard-equipped Android phones, all of which tended to look quite different. With the right marketing and some slight design tweaks, the Xperia Play could have been made an interesting sell to folks my age at the time. But even then, getting past the game selection and public perception, there's also the specter of the N-Gage. While completely off store shelves at that point, the massive failure of the first mainstream gaming phone likely added some hesitancy toward folks investing in a new gaming phone platform. Based on public comments made close to launch, it's clear the N-Gage had left a sour taste in many folks' mouths, and was something Sony Ericsson was consciously trying not to duplicate. As someone who spent way too much time playing games on an N-Gage QD back in the day, I can tell you for certain that the Xperia Play is a much better gaming device. A physical gamepad instead of numpad makes a huge difference. Still, it's a shadow that no doubt combined with all the other factors I just mentioned to contribute to why the Xperia Play had abysmal sales. And abysmal is not exactly a hyperbole. By 2012, Sony Ericsson phones accounted for only a small percentage of the overall smartphone market. Xperia phones, in general, accounted for only a small percentage of that small percentage of the market Sony Ericsson occupied. Worse yet, sales for PS1 ports on Android market failed to make even a whimper amongst the folks who decided to buy an Xperia Play. All games, except for the pre-packed Crash Bandicoot port, failed to reach even 1,000 downloads overall. Poor hardware sales, poor software sales, likely combined with the Vita's lackluster launch, all of it likely threw enough red flags for higher-ups to cancel the hardware line altogether, despite an Xperia Play 2 having reportedly been in development. While Sony still creates Xperia-branded phones, they're usually pricier devices focusing more on Sony's camera tech rather than the gaming performance. Even with the overall shift in Android and cloud gaming to make better use of physical controls, and many folks clamoring for a modern Xperia Play sequel, the idea of Sony re-entering the gaming phone market at this point feels a bit slim. Following their dual simultaneous handheld failures, Sony moved to a more software-focused mobile approach. They launched PlayStation Mobile in 2012 to offer limited PlayStation certified experiences to their handhelds in a variety of non-Sony devices. That same year, cloud gaming came to the Xperia Play and other Android devices via the now defunct OnLive service. Unfortunately, neither PlayStation Mobile nor OnLive made much of a splash. A couple years later, PS4 Remote Play would come to other Xperia phones, skipping over the Xperia Play. Beyond a few random Android experiences created by PlayStation over the years, Remote Play has remained their central handheld focus ever since, culminating in the release of the PlayStation Portal not too long ago. It's a bit of a shame, but honestly, I'm not sure I could blame them for never wanting to tread those waters again, after both the Play and Vita failed so spectacularly. Even their latest handheld tech, the Portal, feels cautious in its reliance on a PS5 connection, as if to say, it's fine if this fails, it's just a PS5 accessory anyway. Though Sony could have been much more aggressive on doubling down on either handheld platform, the Xperia Play in particular feels like a case in which the market voted with their money and didn't quite want what it offered at the time. As much as many folks might begrudge that truth, it's a common thread that niche hardware like the Play remains niche because few people wanted them while they were new. At this point in my smartphone retrospectives, I typically take a moment to look at the phone from a modern perspective. If you were to buy this smartphone today, what should you expect? That angle made perfect sense for my LG Wing and Axon M videos. Go check them out if you haven't, by the way. But the Xperia Play is a bit of a different machine altogether. To no one's surprise, it's unusable as a smartphone at this point. Mine's running Android 2.3.1 and is completely unable to connect to Google's servers. Updates ended a long time ago, but even installing new apps is a very manual process that requires sourcing APK files from creative locations on the internet. It is still possible to root the device and install a custom port of Android 4, but that's beyond the scope of this video. From my perspective, I like to keep the older tech like this functioning as it was when it was on the market. So yeah, if you're considering picking up an Xperia Play these days, know going in that some extra work is needed up front, and doing anything with it will require you to learn how to do some old school Android modding, or find older Android apps on the internet that are compatible with Android 2.3. However, if you don't mind a bit of manual jankiness, the Xperia Play is actually surprisingly useful as a hyper-compact, low-powered retro handheld. To get a sense of what I mean by that, here's a comparison between my Xperia Play and PSP 2000. When closed, the entire body of the Play is only slightly larger than my PSP's display. In terms of pocketability, it's hard to find a more compact device these days without needing a magnifying glass to view the display. Sliding the device open reveals surprisingly solid physical controls. Each button is about 20% smaller than those on a PSP, and about a third the travel. Larger buttons on a larger device are bound to feel much better, but these controls have a soft, tactile click to them that I actually really enjoy. Unfortunately, the shoulder buttons don't fare quite as well due to the form factor constraints, but they are still more than usable in practice. Altogether, the controls feel very good to play a couple quick levels of Crash Bandicoot. For those with larger hands, like me, it's likely not a device to play on for hours on end, but it's more than enjoyable in short bursts. The only real letdown are the two touchpads on the gamepad. These are meant to mimic analog sticks on a DualShock controller, but they're inconsistent in practice. Certain Android apps like Minecraft Pocket Edition make great use of the sticks as intended, and it feels great. Other games, emulators included, either don't use them at all or seem to have limited compatibility. Outside the few optimized use cases, setting the pads to L2 and R2, as is the default on Crash Bandicoot, has seemed like the best option for me. Okay, enough about controls. What games can this thing actually play? Well, a surprising amount actually. With its entire lifespan behind it, there are more than a few older optimized Android games which could make for a good afternoon of messing around for the right person. Through some digging, I was able to find APK files for some of the games optimized to work with the Play. These games range from the pack-in Bruce Lee fighting game to an updated version of Minecraft to an interesting Assassin's Creed port. The common thread after messing with a bunch of these games is that good games are made better with physical controls. Nothing feels quite as solid as larger modern handhelds playing modern games, but that's kinda expected. For all it's worth, this is a window back to older Android, and half the experience is seeing how far mobile gaming has come from back then, while also appreciating how solid certain experiences actually were back then. One downside to taking a trip back in time is actually the sparse internal memory. Many Android apps will need to be installed on the phone's 1 gigabyte of onboard storage without the option to move them to an SD card. Given the large amount of Verizon bloatware I found on my R800X model, which I can't uninstall without rooting the device, that limited storage is at a constant premium. Luckily, the microSD card I have installed is large enough to fit my various APK files and has allowed me to uninstall and reinstall games as needed. It's a hassle, for sure, but manageable considering the dedication already needed to play Android games this way. Now, Android gaming is really fun, but I'm sure most folks would buy this device for its emulation abilities, which in that department, it actually really shines. Anything up to Game Boy Advance and SNES work quite well. In my opinion, it's pretty much the perfect size and shape for digging into some older Game Boy Advance games. SNES, meanwhile, does introduce some rather thick black bars around gameplay due to the display's aspect ratio, but while playing Yoshi's Island for a bit, performance felt incredibly solid, and it wasn't too much of a strain to keep track of what was going on the display. It's a fairly comfortable experience overall, and makes me wish Nintendo had created a sliding handheld of their own. Getting past those easier to run systems can be a bit of a mixed bag though. After trying Super Mario 64, Mario Kart, and a few other N64 games, N64 emulation tends to work just fine on average, with a typical note that there's always going to be edge cases. But there's one big issue, and that's the fact that my standalone N64 emulator doesn't recognize either touchpad, nor do the RetroArch cores that I've tried, because they've all kind of failed to load. As a result, the games I've played have essentially lacked D-pad and C button support, which limits gameplay options quite a bit. Your mileage may vary, especially if you're able to hunt down a different, more compatible emulator, but this is truly a case where form limits function for N64 gameplay. PS1 emulation is much more capable comparatively. As the headlining feature for the Xperia Play, it's solid when used with the official emulator, and still pretty great when used with unofficial emulators. Of course, unofficial emulators are going to be the main method to play most games. Beyond Crash Bandicoot, a number of PS1 games were ultimately ported to Android market for use with the Xperia Play, but given that those can no longer be downloaded through official means, it's up to you to find an archive of them from some organization online to actually experience those games. If you can, it should work pretty well, though I can't quite confirm that beyond videos I've watched and articles I've read online. Every PS1 game download I stumble across throws an error when I attempt to install its files, which itself is a very cumbersome process, a lot more complex than installing a regular APK file. Given that the PS1's library was much broader than the ports made available, you will eventually want to play games that Sony didn't make available officially though, which is technically doable via the official emulator. Not long after the Xperia Play launched, a developer named Yifan Liu created a Java-based program to utilize files from the official Crash Bandicoot download to repackage PS1 ROMs into APK files that could be played on an Xperia Play in the same way as the official ports. Unfortunately, Yifan Liu stopped development on the project a while ago and has seemingly scrubbed their GitHub page of the files needed to run the program. Through the magic of the Wayback Machine, I was able to download the original files, run the program, and repackage a few games. But after hours of troubleshooting, I ultimately couldn't get any of the games to work with my play. Full disclosure though, I've no doubt this is 100% user error, and I'm probably missing some vital component to make everything work. I'm just kinda out of additional things to try at this point. If you'd like to see PS Xperia working as intended, I'll have a link to a Modern Vintage Gamer video in the description demonstrating it in action. It's actually really cool once it actually works. However, my point here is that while you can technically expand usage of the official emulator, it's bound to take a lot more work to get running than most people might want to put in. Unofficial emulators will be easier, but there's still a bit of a hassle if I'm being honest. Mainly, that's because I can't access the Play Store. I have to find APKs manually that specifically work with the Xperia Play, and the APKs I see recommended most for the Xperia Play, like EPSXE, have installs behind paywalls on the Play Store. After a ton of searching, I was able to find a version of RetroArch someone posted to Reddit that was compiled to work specifically with the Xperia Play's controls, as well as a version of EPSXE someone posted to the internet, potentially against the dev's wishes. I've no clue, but as with the official emulator, it's worth noting that you'll need to do some digging to find something that works well for you. To save you some effort, I will leave a link to the thread I found with a copy of RetroArch down in the description. No guarantees that it's going to work by the time you're watching this, but after installation, I'd recommend reading the comments on that thread to find some tweaks you might need to make. Anyway, with the emulator problem solved, unofficial emulation works surprisingly well, depending on the emulator and the game, of course. After trying a few games through RetroArch, I found the experience to be about as smooth as Crash Bandicoot was with the official emulator. Some additional settings even allow for limited use of the touchpads as either thumbsticks or individual buttons. Touchpad support here is far removed from the analog implementation in games like Minecraft, but it is still good enough to use those pads to map extra buttons if needed. I really enjoyed my time running through the first level of Spyro 2 this way, and could see a lot of folks having a similarly good time. Compatibility is a bit hit or miss though with RetroArch. While Crash 2 and Spyro 2 worked just fine, Crash Team Racing proved a glitchy mess. Luckily, switching to EPSXE solved that issue. The standalone emulator appears to run a bit smoother overall. Unfortunately, at least for the version I found, it doesn't register input from the touchpads. That kind of sucks, but that's still probably going to be fine for many games. In general, the Xperia Play is still a pretty good retro gaming machine that also offers some very unique Android gaming experiences. As purely a gaming device, there's a ton to love about the Xperia Play for folks who are willing to put in the effort. Of course, that effort is also what makes the Xperia Play hard to recommend for anyone looking for an experience beyond reliving old Android. Currently, here in the US, on eBay, I see Xperia Plays selling for around $100, which is about what I paid for mine 2 years ago. If you get lucky, you might also find one that's preloaded with basic emulators and apps to reduce the amount of work you need upfront to get started. That's how mine arrived. That's not a given though, and you'll need to read listings closely if that's exactly what you're looking for. Meanwhile, for the same price, you could also just grab a Retroid Pocket 2S, Anbernic 353XX, or PSP. You may not have access to those old Android games, if that matters to you, but each of those devices will be able to emulate the same systems, and more to potentially higher quality. Newer devices will perform better, be easier to set up, and have much wider compatibility. Given the amount of time I've invested just trying to explore what the Xperia Play has to offer, I would consider the Play more of a side project for tinkerers, rather than a broadly appealing retro emulation device. Which in hindsight, is kinda interesting. The original failure of the Xperia Play at launch was in how niche it felt and how it really didn't appeal to the types of people that could have led to its success for various reasons. Nowadays, when a gaming phone like the Xperia Play would actually be very popular, it's a bit too old to capitalize on the modern, renewed interest in retro emulation. If it had come out only a few years later, with a more performant processor and maybe read Android 5 instead of Android 2.3, I think the story of this device and the Xperia brand in general could have been a lot different. Even if it also didn't see financial success at that point, it might have still held its own against other retro handhelds at its price point today. As it is now, the Xperia Play is more so a novelty of the past and what gaming phones could have been if handheld gaming had went a different route during the 2010s. I'd love to see Sony retread those waters again in the future, especially with the same sort of niche mindset that they have for their current Xperia phones. But I have a feeling that the Xperia Play and PS Vita were a 1-2 punch that completely knocked out any interest Sony had for handheld consoles. Those are my thoughts though. Now, I'd love to know yours. Did you own an Xperia Play back in the day and have experiences you'd like to share? Are you looking to buy an Xperia Play right now and have additional questions you'd like me to answer? Or do you think there's another crucial piece to the Xperia Play's history that I've completely overlooked? Let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video interesting or informative, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. Now that I've made videos on the Xperia Play, PS Vita, and PS TV, I think it's about time I revisited the 3DS's story for my next handheld videos. Then, on the smartphone front, I'm actually currently testing an LG V60 to see how it holds up after 3 years of the Surface Duo existing. Make sure you get subscribed so that you don't miss out on either of those videos. That's gonna be all for this video though. Thank you so much for watching and staying all the way until the end. I know this has been a really long video. It's felt long recording it at least. But hey, until next time, catch you later.